Thank you for inviting me to address this really important session, and it's great to be following that discussion between David and Curtis just now. I know you're considering today the intersection between climate and nature, and rightly so. But in fact, I would say that describing this as an intersection doesn't really do it justice. The fight against climate change and the work to arrest nature's decline and then begin its recovery are fundamentally and inextricably entwined at every level. Climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin, and we have no hope of keeping global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees without a massive restoration of nature. But nor will we be able to revive our natural systems unless we can arrest the inextricable warming of our planet. Thankfully, this is increasingly recognised. More and more global leaders in government and business start to understand the equation. And while we need to see far more action to restore nature to help win the fight against climate change, there are encouraging moves, not least at this COP, where we've seen more than 100 heads of government pledge to halt and reverse deforestation and land degradation by 2030. Now, it's vital that this climate promise and other climate promises are kept. Protecting biodiversity matters for so many reasons. For the fight against climate change, as I've said, but also for the stability of our food, our farming and our fisheries, to ensure that we have clean water to drink and unpolluted air to breathe. Because even though we are freshly astonished daily by the diversity, the richness of our natural world, we still know so little about it. So we don't yet fully understand what we are losing. And of course, because of its intrinsic beauty and worth, it's not actually ours to plunder, and it is a duty for us to bequeath it to generations to come. But of course, it also fundamentally matters to our health and our economies, and indeed our future prosperity. Following the publication of the Disruptor report on the economics of biodiversity early this year, Swiss Re Institute published its own report showing that 55% of global GDP is dependent on high-functioning biodiversity and ecosystem services. It also found that a fifth of countries globally, are at risk of their ecosystems collapsing. That will mean the collapse too of so many of the supply chains and the markets on which businesses depend, and indeed we all enjoy. The finance sector has a particularly big responsibility to drive a fundamental change of direction. Investors, insurers and banks control so much of how and indeed where money flows and the activities it supports. And at the moment, too much of this finance is flooding into activities that jeopardise our future. Analysis this year by WWF and Greenpeace found that UK financial institutions are responsible for 1.8 times of the UK's annual net emissions of CO2, driving the high carbon economy. If the City of London was a country, it would be the world's 9th biggest emitter. But it's not just about climate change. The decisions financial institutions make and the businesses they support determine whether or not the Amazon is deforested, whether we convert nature-rich grasslands to farming, to monocultures, whether our fisheries are plundered, the ocean and the devastating seabed, or indeed support to sustainable livelihoods, and they also impact whether or not there are thriving communities. We welcome the voluntary commitments made by the financial sector to address deforestation this week, but we have, if I'm honest, seen so many commitments before. And as a recent WWF report shows, levels of UK investment exposed effectively to deforestation risk have remained consistently high since the Paris Agreement in 2015. So while financial institutions can themselves decide how to change how they operate, regulate and indeed support government policies, this is an essential step forward too. We're therefore very excited by the announcement at this COP that the UK will be the world's first net zero financial sector, with financial institutions and listed companies mandated to publish science-based net zero transition plans. That indeed should be a wake-up call for the 80% of the FTSE companies who currently are without credible climate action plans. But it should also importantly serve as an example for other countries to follow. This is a global fight in which every nation and every financial sector must be fully engaged. What else can financial institutions do to embed not just climate action but biodiversity restoration in their decision making? Well, we know they should also now start to measure and assess the impact of their investments on deforestation, freshwater, ocean, soils, and much more, and the associated risks. And we very much welcome the work of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which will undoubtedly assist with this. Reducing our negative impact on the natural resources that underpin our economies is critical to future prosperity. And then all businesses and the finance sector players need transition plans to be net nature positive, not just net zero carbon. That means setting ambitious goals to restore nature and actively take place in terms of large-scale investment in nature-based solutions. Addressing the interlinked net zero and nature challenges in the same framework is in fact the only coherent solution. The decisions we make today will resonate for decades and indeed centuries to come, not just for the businesses of today, but for all our futures and for the future of our planet that is our one shared home. Nothing less than wholesale systemic change will do, and the finance sector is uniquely placed to drive that change across the globe. Thank you very much.
Hello, this is Jane Goodall. First, thank you so much for inviting me to say a few words. Isn't it strange that the most intellectual creature to walk this planet is destroying its only home? We can send a rocket to Mars with a robot to take photos, but we're trashing the environment, cutting down forests, polluting earth, water and air, killing and exploiting wildlife. And so we've created climate change by our absolute disrespect of nature. There seems to be some sort of disconnect between our clever brain and our heart, where poetically we seek love and compassion. We've lost wisdom. We all know that as planet Earth warms, weather patterns change. Hurricanes, typhoons, flooding, droughts, heat waves and fires are more frequent and worse. This is already affecting nature around the globe, as well as us. Some animal species and plants are able to adapt. Some are able to move to cooler places. Those that can neither adapt or move are doomed. The plight of the polar bear as the ice sheets melt is well known, and their future is uncertain. Oceans and forests have been described as the lungs of the planet, absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere and emitting oxygen. And huge amounts of CO2, as you know, is released into the atmosphere as we burn fossil fuel and as we destroy forests and other ecosystems that absorb atmospheric CO2 and store carbon. But although the oceans help reduce climate change by absorbing large amounts of CO2, increasing levels of this dissolved in the ocean is changing the chemistry of seawater, making it more acidic, so that it's more difficult for animals such as corals and shellfish to build their exoskeletons and shells. And this is one of the things disrupting the balance of nature in the ocean. In addition, ocean surface water is expanding as it warms up, and this, along with water from the melting ice sheets, ice caps and glaciers, is causing rising sea levels. Wetlands and marshes in coastal areas become polluted with salt water or vanish under the sea, with catastrophic impact on wildlife there. Finally, these warmer waters may promote the development of stronger storms in the tropics, and this is also damaging to wildlife in coastal areas. Higher temperatures are causing more and longer droughts, so that more land is susceptible to wildfires. Fire's always been a part of some ecosystems, but now more land is drier and burning seasons are longer, and many plants and animals are suffering. The recent terrible bushfires in Australia destroyed vast areas of habitat, and over 1 billion animals died, including the iconic koala bears. Last year, fueled by extreme heat waves and record droughts, wildfires ravaged habitats in many other parts of the world, including unprecedented conflagrations that raged across Siberia. They were larger than all the other wildfires around the world combined. Many animals and plants have evolved to adapt to fire, but recent wildfires destroyed so much habitat that even animals that escaped them ended up dying of starvation. Perhaps some of you are wondering why I've been asked to talk about the relationship between climate change and nature. It's, I think, because we humans are part of the natural world, and indeed we depend on it for clean air, water, food, everything. But what we depend on is healthy ecosystems, and they're made up of the complex interrelationships of their various animal and plant species, that is, their biodiversity. And as more and more species become extinct, often as a result of climate change, ecosystems, and remember we depend on them, may collapse. Climate change doesn't only affect nature, it affects us too. Tropical insects and ticks are spreading their range as they can thrive now in areas that were previously too cold. Some are vectors of diseases such as malaria, West Nile virus, dengue fever, and Lyme's disease, so that these are appearing in places where they were absent before. Millions of people around the world have been forced to leave their homes because of extended periods of drought or flooding or hurricanes or sea level rise. Some islands have already disappeared. In affluent societies, people can move, and in the US, many people from low-lying coastal areas are moving or planning to move to cities further inland. But desperate climate refugees from poor communities are arriving in ever-increasing numbers, and you well know the problems this is creating. And let me emphasize again that it's been our absolute disrespect of the natural world that's led to climate change. I think that today more business and government leaders understand that we have to abandon the absurd notion that there can be unlimited economic development in a world with finite natural resources, that the annual growth of GDP is more important than protecting the environment and slowing down climate change. Governments alone simply can't deal with the terrible situation we've created, so that business and the private sector must play an ever more important role. Carrying on with business as usual simply won't work. And more businesses are working to become carbon neutral, source their products in a sustainable way, ensure living wages for suppliers and staff. And many are encouraging their staff to help restore degraded land, plant trees in collaboration with local people, and alleviate poverty. This last is really important because poverty can force people to destroy their environment simply in order to survive, to cut down trees, to sell for timber or charcoal, for example. There's growing understanding that so-called conventional agriculture, with its reliance on chemical and often toxic pesticides and herbicides, is destroying biodiversity and killing the soil on which we depend. Growing knowledge that factory farming of billions of animals is not only horribly cruel, but devastating the environment to grow the grain to feed them. Moreover, the animals are producing vast amounts of methane, a very virulent greenhouse gas. And there are now major efforts by some businesses to promote small-scale family farming, regenerative agriculture, permaculture, and so on. I could talk for a long time about what some businesses are already doing, what others plan to do, but that's what you'll all be discussing. Let me end with one little story. I was talking to the CEO of a big corporation the other day, and he said, "Jane, we're changing the way we do our business. We're moving to be carbon neutral and really improve the ethical way we operate." And it's for three reasons. Firstly, because we've seen the writing on the wall. We realize we cannot go on exploiting the finite natural resources of the planet. And if we go on doing so, that's the end of us and our business. Secondly, consumer pressure. More and more people are demanding goods that are produced in an ethical manner. But what really tipped the balance for me was a few years ago when my little girl, about 10, came back from school one day and said, "Daddy, they're telling me that what you're doing is hurting the planet. And it's my planet. It's not true, is it?" That is what touched me. And that is what is important. People have to change from within to really change, to make a commitment and keep to it for future generations. I hope that you have very productive discussions. Thank you.